Hello, my name is Gabriel Antalan, and I am going to be talking about Psalm 2. That is the passage that I chose for this class. And so I'm going to be doing this presentation on a formal analysis and interpretation of Psalm chapter 2. So for my thesis, I have that Psalm 2 serves as a foundational text for understanding God's sovereign rule, the role of the Messiah, and the tension between divine authority and human resistance, a theme echoed throughout biblical history and fulfilled in Christ. Through an exegesis of the text and engagement with scholarly interpretations, I will highlight how genre, structure, and intertextual connections shape the Psalm's theological significance. So for literary context, I have that Psalm 2 is written by King David, and it is part of the intro to Psalms. It is very interconnected with Psalm 1, and so while Psalm 1 contrasts the righteous versus the wicked, living righteously for the Lord or living in step with the wicked, Psalm 2 goes a little bit of a different approach by talking about just the nations, the world overall at large, being in conflict with God's anointed one. And for us Christians, looking back on that and interpreting anointed one, or the one that God has made his son, as Jesus Christ. The Psalm 2 also brings into play this idea that wisdom is equated with submitting to God's rule. So God is so powerful and he's so mighty that he scoffs and he laughs at the rulers of the world who think that they have any chance against him, or that they have any ability to supersede his power. For genre, there's three different ways that you can classify Psalm 2. It is going to be considered biblical poetry, which is parts of the Bible that incorporate patterns of repetition, very detailed imagery to create very beautiful pictures in one's mind, a metaphor, which is basically just a lot of comparison between two different ideas. You could utilize imagery to do that, or you could utilize very literal words to do that, and rhetorical questions either asked of the writer or asked of God. And while it is also biblical poetry, it is classified as a royal psalm or a messianic psalm. Certain psalms were used as a tool during the enthronement of a king, and so you could use a royal psalm to celebrate those instances, or to just make a declaration of a new ruler. And a messianic psalm is just looking into the book of Psalms, looking at the prophetic nature of many of those psalms, and seeing Jesus intertwined into those psalms. And so a messianic psalm is very clearly going to be a psalm that speaks of a divinely appointed ruler. For us, we would definitely consider that Jesus Christ. So for the bit on canonical interpretation, there are three different passages in the New Testament, or in the Bible actually, other than Psalm 2, where Psalm 2 is referenced. And so the first one is going to be Acts 4:25 through 28. And this is just the beginning of the early church. And so as the church is spreading, Paul and all of the apostles are doing their work. They are facing persecution in those contexts. And so in response to that persecution, Psalm 2 is brought back up, just pointing to that as a fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus has come. The Messiah has come. Psalm 2 being that messianic psalm that we just talked about. Jesus is that Messiah, and he has come to fulfill that prophecy. In Hebrews 5:1 through 10, it references the part of Psalm 2 where it says, "You are my son. Today you are my son and I am your father. And so in the book of Hebrews has this big theme of a high priest. And so it is definitely highlighting Jesus Christ as that high priest. The last reference from Psalm 2 to the New Testament is going to be Revelation chapter 12, 1 through 9, which talks about a rule with a rod of iron. And so, looking into the more of the context and even the poetic nature of Psalm 2, you can identify that it's not speaking of a literal rod of iron, most likely, but it is speaking of a figurative rod of iron that just reflects and talks about Jesus being the eternal ruler of the world, and how in the book of Revelation, when everything is coming together and all of prophecy is being fulfilled, it all points back to the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. For theological interpretation, there are going to be a variety of different ways that you could look at Psalm 2, but ultimately you're just looking at Jesus Christ being the main point of the psalm. So Psalm 2 is going to point to God's divine sovereignty. He is the creator of the universe. He is the most powerful being to exist, and we are called to submit to him. Because Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm, it's going to talk about that kingship, that Jesus is the heir to the world, to the universe, that everything that exists created by God belongs to Jesus Christ. It is going to deal with themes of rebellion versus submission to God, that we can rebel and we have free will, we have the ability to do what we choose to do, but at the end of the day, God is all powerful, and he laughs at us, he scoffs at us, because our power is nothing compared to his, and we are much better off being safely within his hands. And of course, just pointing to the fact that Jesus Christ is the King, yesterday, today, and always. So that is theological interpretation. And so we also have canonical interpretation. Historical context, my bad. So historical context is going to be the last bit here. And so historically, we know that majority of the Psalms were written by King David. Not all of them were, but specifically Psalm 2 is attributed to David. And so we can just ascertain and just kind of deduce the fact that because David was the king of Israel, he was arguably the greatest king of Israel, he was speaking from a perspective of being a king and the sort of realities that he was facing while he was a king, what it's like to be a king of Israel, be a king in those times, and also just political realities that they were facing. They were facing conflict from the Philistines, and they were facing conflict from all these surrounding nations. And because David was not able to build the temple, Solomon had to, because Solomon was considered a man of peace. David was not allowed to by God because God considered him a man of war. And so the reality of that, David was faced with a lot of war around him. And because of that, that just helps us to give a little bit more of a picture into our mind of the context behind why Psalm 2 was written, and how it relates to this chapter in David's life. So it would speak about David's role because David might be speaking about himself, but obviously in the prophetic nature, Jesus Christ is not explicitly mentioned in Psalm 2, but from a Christian perspective, from a theological perspective, for Christians today, we look back and we see Son, and we see themes of the Messiah, and we make it very clear that it is pointing to Jesus, that this is prophetic of Jesus Christ. And here are sources. And that is my presentation. All right, thank you. It was awesome studying Psalm 2. Have a great day. Bye-bye.